Fans waited a long time for Final Fantasy VII Remake, and Nintendo fans have waited even longer. But with Switch 2, Nintendo finally has the hardware to do this PS4-era classic justice. I think Square Enix is successful here, though the Switch 2 release doesn't really map onto any existing version of the game completely. But before we get into the Switch 2 version and all of its various technicalities and changes, a word from John.
You know this view, you've seen it hundreds of times on DF Direct Weekly, but just out of frame here, there's a whole other world happening. This is the side you never see, the working side. This is where my monitors and general workspace live, day in and day out. And over the last month, it has evolved thanks to the FlexiSpot E7 Pro, which has quietly become the backbone of my entire DF setup. When FlexiSpot approached us, I already had my eye on one of these desks, and I'm pleased to see that it ticks off exactly all the checkboxes I needed. Yes, it's a motorized standing desk, something I've already used for years, but as display sizes increased, stability became a real issue. With the E7 Pro, even at full height, it barely moves, which is important when you're dealing with, well, Digital Foundry grade hardware. The E7 Pro is rated for a load capacity up to 160 kilograms, so this thing barely registers. When I have the urge to put the FW900 back on the desk, it's ready. There's a wide range of table sizes too. This 180 centimeter tabletop perfectly handles a large 45-inch ultra-wide monitor, as you can see here. I'm also a fan of the control panel with the presets and USB-C charging on the side, plus it's a whole lot faster going up and down than my previous desk. It also has proper cable management down here, which, as you might expect, is pretty important. I run a lot of different hardware on my desk and was easily able to organize my cables, mount a sizable power strip, and tuck away some power bricks. So yeah, you always see this view on DF Direct, but behind the scenes, the FlexiSpot E7 Pro is doing the heavy lifting. If you want to check it out, head over to flexispot.com and use the code YTE730 to save.
The most interesting comparison point for us here, I think, lies in the game's texture work. The PS4 version of Final Fantasy VII Remake presented a lot of low-quality texture assets. These infamous doors in the Sector 7 slums earned the most ire, but soupy textures were sprinkled all over the game. The PS5 Intergrade release addressed most of these issues, but the PS4 version's flaws were never rectified. With a lot of this texture art, Switch 2 is essentially a match for the PS5 release. The infamous doors and the surrounding walls and metals are at full spec, crisp, and with a pleasingly high-res treatment. These surfaces were amusingly blurry before, but on Switch 2, they slot in just fine. Likewise for ground textures in the Sector 7 slums, which are depicted with appropriate clarity. Key signage is clean and readable on Switch 2, like this 7th Heaven menu board, which matches PS5, or the advertisements outside this restaurant. If you put the camera right up against certain walls, you'll be able to notice some higher grade texture art on Switch 2 as well. Plus, texture popping issues aren't an issue on Switch 2. If we run up to the canned foods shop on PS4, the texture asset remains primitive until a few seconds after we stop. On Switch 2, there's no apparent lag in texture streaming whatsoever. But it's not all rainbows and path tracing. A large amount of the texture assets I looked at on Switch 2 mirror PS4. This sign, for instance, is relatively clear on PS5, but I struggled to parse it on PS4 and Switch 2. Likewise for this Chocobo ad, which is still a little chunky on PS5, but clearly has a higher resolution appearance. These rock faces also lack resolution on Switch 2, and even lose a texture layer in this shot. Like a lot of assets in FF7 Remake, expect to see chunky geometry on all platforms, but clearly the 2D art is higher grade on PS5. In particular, I found a lot of issues with the ground and rock textures in the opening section of the separate Intergrade campaign on Switch 2, which isn't accessible on PS4. I suspect this area was probably built with PS5 as the target platform, so it doesn't scale quite as nicely on Switch 2, with a fair number of iffy textures. Switch 2 generally has fine enough texture art, especially in handheld play, but Switch 2 doesn't quite plunder the whole cache of Intergrade assets. Switch 2's RAM capacity straddles the two PlayStations, and its streaming capability likely follows, so these choices make some sense. Shadows are next up, and here the story is more straightforward. Switch 2 seems to have shadow map quality quite similar to PS4. The cascade lines and shadow detail generally correspond on the two weaker machines, while PS5 gets a considerable clarity boost. I wouldn't expect a huge difference in most scenes. It's usually only obvious if you start poring over shadow detail. There are occasional areas where the differences become more pronounced, though the deltas are harder to spot in your typical sun shadow. Character pop-in on Switch 2 is also typically a match for PS4. On longer views, NPCs that are present on PS5 are absent from the weaker consoles. When we actually approach these NPCs, Switch 2 and PS4 usually pop in at about the same distance, though curiously in one test Switch 2 is delayed slightly. This is only really a factor in town areas as other parts of the game are NPC light. But the most significant differences between the various versions come down to the Intergrade lighting changes. Switch 2 is based on the same Intergrade release as PS5, and the PS5 release of FF7 Remake has lighting that has been revised somewhat artistically. For example, in these cutscenes in 7th Heaven, some lighting in the background has been removed. Specular highlights are more prominent on the bar and wine bottles. Screen space reflections apply more broadly, and pre-calculated shadows are higher quality, among other changes. Some of these tweaks are driven by additional hardware power on current generation consoles, but many of the alterations seem driven more by artist fine-tuning, especially in cutscenes. These scenes are lit with a heavy use of unmotivated lighting and character lights that don't affect the environment, benefiting from careful per-shot tweaks. As a general rule, I would say the new lighting tends to look more physically plausible, leans much more heavily on volumetric lighting, and usually differs the most in scenes that aren't lit with direct sunlight. This generally translates just fine to Switch 2, with the exception of some lower resolution volumetric lighting, which is sometimes noticeable. On Switch 2, image quality is surprisingly impressive. The raw metrics aren't terribly exciting. In dock mode, Switch 2 appears to render at 1080p with a 1080p output, likely using a DLSS variant. But image quality in stills is much sharper and cleaner than PS4, and often compares favorably to PS5 in performance mode as well. In motion, expect worse results, but it holds up just fine in most scenarios. I think we're looking at one of the models we call Tiny DLSS, or DLSS Lite. That's because it has very hard-edged artifact patterns on recently disoccluded details, with no attempt at anti-aliasing. It tends to anti-alias parts of the image that are relatively stable quite well, but fares a lot worse with movement. Even though I think this is one of the lower quality models, because it's operating from such a high internal resolution and likely being used just as AA, it tends to look relatively clean and clear compared to games like Hogwarts Legacy. Image quality in the demo fared worse, I think, than in the full game, which tends to have brighter, more uniform scenes that catch aliasing on particles and highlights less. Unfortunately, Switch 2 tends to have an issue with dither patterns presenting under certain lighting conditions. These aren't noticeable at a distance, but if you get close to a TV or monitor, they are very apparent. I think this mostly comes down to an interaction between certain lighting effects and the game's DLSS. In docked mode, I don't think this is a big issue, more of an occasional annoyance. Portable mode is another story, though we'll touch on that in more detail shortly. Performance in docked mode is very solid. This is a 30 FPS only game, but it essentially locks to that 30 FPS during gameplay. In my capture, it's a flat 30 FPS line throughout, even during fast town traversal and intense combat. 30 FPS might not sound too appetizing for modern tastes, but input response feels fine, and I generally found the game perfectly acceptable. Cutscenes are an exception, as dropped frames on camera cuts are pretty common. These are hard to notice in my experience while actually playing though. Loading times are very good as well. Compared to PS4, Switch 2 is loading in at a fraction of the time, whether from SD Express or off the internal 256GB SSD. SD Express load times are a little slower, about 2 to 3 seconds off the pace in these tests, but it's a relatively small difference. Remake doesn't often present loading screens to the player outside of the initial load into the world, but the improvement is appreciated. PS5 though is much speedier than the other consoles, clocking in with a lightning-fast 2-second load into each of these chapters. In percentage terms, it's a massive speedup, but the absolute time spent in loading screens is still quite low on Switch 2. So far we've been addressing the docked experience, but we haven't really looked at handheld mode. In a lot of respects, it's very similar. It uses an internal resolution that seems to hover around 720p, but may have some DRS behavior based on my pixel counts. I don't want to be too dispositive here because the capture quality from the Switch 2 in portable play is pretty low, but it seems to be typically around 720p internally. That imagery is upsampled using DLSS to a crisp 1080p-like image on Switch 2. The game's relatively constrained environments, lack of foliage, and heavy reliance on offline lighting give it an edge over other Switch 2 games that lean on DLSS though. And circa 720p is a pretty decent internal resolution to upscale from. The same pain points in docked mode hurt a little more here, like hair cards and particles, but for a game of this caliber, portable mode IQ is quite good. Unfortunately, the same dithering patterns that we saw in docked mode are amplified in portable play. Dithering shows up in the same places that you'd expect, like the edges of shadows, and in foliage and ambient occlusion, but it's also a factor on the ground here, which is an opaque surface that's lit directly from the sun. Perhaps the more aggressive DLSS is revealing high-frequency dithering artifacts, which aren't being averaged in the same way as the game's TAA. It's not a big issue in my opinion, and the game still typically looks quite handsome, but it is an odd artifact. Beyond image quality, visual settings typically correspond between docked and portable play. The two key tweakables on PC, shadow quality and NPC draw distance, don't appear to diverge much, if at all, between the game's two profiles. Screen space reflections are present in both modes, ambient occlusion looks similar, and foliage density is the same. Image quality is the key difference, even though the impact of the lower rendering resolution is muted by DLSS. I tested a decent variety of gameplay in portable mode across the game's first 9 chapters, and typically it seems to be a solid 30 FPS experience, at least judged by eye. There are no issues in combat or traversal that I could really see. The only exception came in this shot outside Aerith's house, where a pan reveals jittery, lower framerate camera travel. Final Fantasy seems to be dropping frames here without the benefit of VRR with low framerate compensation, and is presumably GPU limited while rendering this view of the environment. I tried to sample a wide range of gameplay here across my saves, though I primarily played in docked mode for the purposes of this review, but I can't say that this is necessarily the only area where the game drops frames in its first 9 chapters. I do think though that any framerate drops are rare and isolated, because my usual stress tests don't cause the game's framerate to waver. Final Fantasy VII Remake in handheld mode is pretty solid, and makes for a satisfying Switch 2 JRPG experience. Obviously, Switch 2 can't pull off the same home console technical feats as a PlayStation 5, but in portable mode, it's at least comparable to the experience on a good PC handheld, and packs much better efficiency. Final Fantasy VII Remake is largely an excellent Switch 2 port, but we kind of already knew this. Last month's demo, which John and I reviewed, ran very well. I drew up some comparisons between the demo build and retail build and didn't spot any differences, at least in the limited section of the game where the two overlap, so I don't think gamers were waiting in too much suspense for the finished title. The full game encompasses much more content though, and it generally passes our evaluations with great marks. Town traversal runs without a hitch, textures often use their upgraded PS5 versions, and loading times are very good. Just about every unanswered question we had from the demo has been resolved in a satisfactory way. It's essentially the PS5 Intergrade version, but running with visual settings closer to PS4, plus the use of DLSS as an AA technique and upscaler. And Remake itself has aged quite well. I think its chief innovation lies in bringing real-time cinematic quality up to CG-like fidelity, with superb animation, exciting direction, and sophisticated rendering. It rivals or surpasses the Final Fantasy CG efforts from the early to mid-2000s, and manages to do so over a staggering 11 hours of cutscene content. On the tech side, it has a solid PBR pipeline and packs fairly sophisticated baked lighting. The environments are a little short on polygons and texture work isn't perfect, but it's aged quite well. It has clear limitations, but it doesn't really have the lighting concessions that typify its open-world successor, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, though I don't want to belabor that too much. We're likely to see that game as well on Switch 2 in the future, given that Square Enix is committed to porting all FF7 Remake series games to Switch 2 and Xbox. I feel like it should port reasonably well, considering its performance on Steam Deck, which has been a decent barometer for Switch 2 feasibility so far. But the last title in the trilogy is less certain. I'd love to see an FF7 Remake Part 3 game on Unreal Engine 5 with all the trimmings, but that would complicate the feasibility of a Switch 2 version. Does Square Enix embrace UE5, or do they stick with their dated UE4 fork for the final sequel? The former can produce maximum fidelity, but the latter provides a proven production pipeline, so sticking with UE4 seems more likely. For now though, Final Fantasy VII Remake is a great looking RPG that has been ported smoothly to Nintendo's new hybrid. If you're looking to play Square's 2020 epic, this is a great option. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at patreon.com/digitalfoundry for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media.